Everybody loves infrastructure spending. It's big, it's beautiful, it creates jobs and growth. It's win-win, it's shovel-ready. Let's start building. Dead wrong. Big infrastructure plans are often bridges to nowhere because political pressure misallocates investments, and 9 out of 10 of these projects experience cost overruns. The infrastructure expert Bent Flyberg has formulated the iron law of mega projects. They are over budget, over time, over and over again. In fact, the least deserving projects get built precisely because the estimates are overly optimistic. Assumptions about job creation are also exaggerated. Even if you accept that Obama's stimulus program created 3 million jobs, they came at a cost of some $400,000 each. Well, if you take $400,000 from the private sector and create one job, you will look very energetic. That is what is seen. What is not seen are all the jobs that money would have created if the government didn't take it. So, sure, if you really need it, build it. But it's not a cure-all. Remember, the road to hell is paved with good intentions and tax dollars. And now for something completely different. Pornography. Because of the internet, it's now available to everybody all the time. And that's dangerous because porn promotes sexism and results in more sexual crime. Dead wrong. Recent research shows that moderate pornography consumption does not harm relationships or make users more aggressive. In fact, some researchers claim that exposure to pornography might make men less likely to commit sexual crime. Countries that liberalized their pornography laws saw a reduction in reported rape, and so did the American states with the most widespread access to the internet. Some claim that pornography is getting more violent and that there is adaptation going on. The more access you have, the more you adapt to the most brutal and beastly stuff. But that's based on anecdotal evidence. When you scan all the pornographic searches on the internet, you notice that truly violent pornography is extremely rare. And there is almost no adaptation. Almost everybody search for the same things over and over again. Not convinced? Go look for yourself. I won't tell. Once upon a time we had secure, unionized jobs and employers who cared about our job satisfaction. Now more of us have to take whatever we can get in the gig economy. Lonely, exploited and exhausted. And dead wrong. As a freelancer myself, I can say that most of us who work independently do that because we prefer that to a traditional 9-to-5 job. McKinsey has surveyed people who have become independent workers with the help of digital platforms like Uber, Airbnb and Etsy. It showed that the great majority, between 70 and 75%, did that actively. They sought those arrangements because they wanted to be their own boss. And contrary to myth, they also report higher job satisfaction than people in traditional jobs. Not just in terms of freedom and creativity, but also in terms of activities performed and hours worked. Granted, there is a sizable minority in the gig economy who would want a traditional job. But you know what? 1 in 6 people in traditional jobs would prefer to be in the gig economy. The cubicle can also be a prison. You can't have free markets and strategic resources. As Paul Krugman warned us, free trade made us dependent on China for rare earth minerals, necessary in almost all high-tech gizmos. So it was a disaster when China restricted exports in 2010. Dead wrong. As long as markets are free, higher prices on a resource gives people incentives to find more of it or substitutes. So when China restricted exports and prices surged, new mines were opened in the US, in Japan, Australia and other places. Metal companies started recycling these minerals from industrial waste. So suddenly, rare earth minerals weren't that rare anymore. And China's share of the world market declined from 97% to 70%. Companies also started developing technologies that used less of them or none at all. Recently, Honda presented a hybrid car engine that didn't use any heavy rare earth minerals at all. It was also lighter and cheaper. Paul Krugman warned us that China's monopoly would give it the power of destruction. But the only thing that China destroyed was its own industry. Trade is dependent on long-distance transportation, and transportation results in carbon dioxide emissions. It's difficult to buy all things locally, like an Apple computer, for example. But couldn't we at least buy these apples locally to save the planet? Dead wrong. In the debate about food miles, we tend to forget that the largest environmental footprint is not made by distance, but by production. The production phase is responsible for 83% of the carbon dioxide in the average American household's food consumption. All transportation combined is responsible for no more than 11%. This means that it might be better to produce things where we need less resources and less energy and then ship them to the places where we want to consume them. For example, because there are places with a better climate or a better growing season, so that we don't have to grow things in greenhouses. One study even showed that it's better for the planet to produce apples in New Zealand and ship them all the way to Britain than to produce them locally. Jeremy Corbyn of the British Labour Party wants a new kind of democratic socialism, with majority decisions controlling local communities, services and workplaces. Isn't that neat? People power. Democratic harmony. Dead wrong. The model for this reform is the direct democracy in Corbyn's own campaign organisation, Momentum. But incidentally, Momentum is right now being torn apart because of this. The leadership wants online voting to guide the organisation, but the opposition in Momentum thinks that that creates unaccountable leaders, so they prefer local groups to make those democratic decisions. The leadership thinks that that would only benefit infiltrators and people who want to spend hours in dull meetings. So a civil war is right now raging in Momentum, with the factions calling one another the splitters and wreckers, Stalinists and even right-wingers. So, a decision model that's supposed to control everything that's important, local communities, workplaces, energy, housing, did not even work to organize the group that want to implement it. You elitists, you globalists, you have no sense of the human cost of the policies you implement. Your free trade killed the American Rust Belt. Dead wrong. Most jobs will last there between 1950 and 1980, before globalization really got going. The death of Rust Belt manufacturing was an inside job. And big business and big labor were not the victims, they were the killers. After the Second World War, the big producers of steel, of cars and tires faced little competition, so they didn't see the need to innovate and become more productive. The only pressure they felt were from trade unions. Southeastern states, they had right-to-work laws in place since the 1950s, which limited the power of trade unions. The Rust Belt didn't, so trade unions could bid up the price of labor. The average worker in the Rust Belt had a wage that was 13% higher than a similar worker in other states. So they had the best jobs on the planet a little while, because in the long run consumers do not prefer more expensive products that are more outdated than the alternatives. Far from being an example of the impact of trade and competition, the Rust Belt is a warning of what happens when you ignore trade and competition. We need protectionism to stop foreign industries, because they destroy our jobs. Shouldn't you be willing to pay a little bit more for the goods in order to save local jobs? Dead wrong. The problem with this idea is that we've tried it again and again, and it's failed every time. President George W. Bush implemented tariffs against Chinese steel to save a few jobs in the US steel industry. But more workers use steel than produce steel. So one study estimated that 200,000 Americans lost their jobs because of the steel tariffs in 2002. more people than worked in the entire steel industry itself. This did not deter President Obama from implementing tariffs against Chinese tires, which saved possibly 1,200 jobs in the US tire industry. But it came at a cost of $900,000 per job saved. And that was a price that consumers had to pay. So they could not use those money to buy goods from other US industries anymore. And it's been estimated that 4,000 people lost their jobs in those industries as a result of this tariff. And this, of course, was before America lost even more jobs because of retaliatory tariffs from the Chinese. So trying to save jobs by limiting competition and consumer choice turns out to destroy even more jobs. We can't leave the nation's industrial future in the hands of chaotic market forces. As Britain's Prime Minister Theresa May puts it, the government should stop stepping back and start stepping up and take an active role in supporting industry. Dead wrong. Industrial policy is rarely a way of picking winners. It's a way of picking losers. If it were so obvious which industries would succeed in the future, they would have found plenty of capital on the free market anyway. There is a theoretical case that the markets miss potential, of course, but the fact that an omniscient being could find those cases doesn't mean that Theresa May or Donald Trump would. That process is always distorted by political opportunism and lobbying, and creates an incentive for firms to invest in lobbying rather than in research and development. It doesn't help future winners, it helps struggling incumbents. An OECD study shows that an increase in the share of such zombie firms in a country's economy by 3.5% reduces that country's labor productivity by 1.2%. As the economic historian Eli Heckscher put it, either a company is viable and then it doesn't need government support, or it's not viable and then it doesn't deserve government support. Fake news swung the US election. We must stop it. Perhaps we should even limit free speech to combat it, as the Swedish Minister for Culture has suggested. Dead wrong. As Thomas Jefferson put it, it is error alone that needs government support. Truth can stand by itself. There was a time when fake news actually meant something more than anything I don't agree with. It was a story that was fabricated to hurt your opponent or to attract clicks to your website. And there were many stories like that in the US campaign. From the fiction of how the Clintons ran a child sex ring from a pizza shop, to the articles about how Trump was endorsed by the Pope. But two researchers recently took a close study of those fake stories to see their real impact. And they concluded that they must have been incredibly convincing in order to have decided the outcome of the election. In fact, such articles would have had to be 36 times more persuasive than a TV ad. Other factors were much more important, like the Russian hacking of the Democrats' email. So the idea that fake news is taking over turns out to be fake news. People here, people there, people everywhere. World population is growing exponentially, and so does resource consumption. This will end in tears. Dead wrong. As the recently deceased and sadly missed Professor of International Health, Hans Rosling, persistently reminded us, the world does not look like it did when we grew up. Economic reforms, better education, better technologies, they've all contributed to a rapid modernization around the world. And child mortality has declined dramatically. Now, children usually bury their parents rather than the other way around. And as more children survive, parents get fewer of them and instead invest more time and energy and resources in each of them. Since 1950, the number of children per woman in East Asia declined from 5.6 to 1.6, and in South Asia from 6 to 2.6. In Latin America, it declined from 5.9 to 2.2. Even in Africa, birth rates are coming down. Today, there are around 2 billion children in the world. According to present trends, in 2100 there will also be 2 billion children in the world. As the ever-eloquent Hans Rosling pointed out, mankind has reached peak children. The United Nations Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, were a tremendous success. So now we need more big projects like that. Sustainable development goals financed by massive foreign aid. Dead wrong. The improvement when it comes to poverty, child mortality and schooling did not come in gift boxes from rich countries. It was homegrown. One study tried to find out the direct effect of the MDG goals by looking at how the indicators improved before September 2000 and after September 2000 when they were agreed upon. And it turned out that most of these indicators did not experience an acceleration after 2000. The improvement that took place had already begun in the same way between 1990 and 2000. Instead, most of this was the result of economic growth and local step-by-step improvements. Some of the countries that made the most progress, like China, didn't receive any foreign aid, and they didn't care much about the Millennium Development Goals. So, for those who believe that development can only come from the top and from abroad, this must be the immaculate conception of progress. Yes, we hear from people like Johan Norberg that extreme poverty has declined more in the last few years than ever before. But those people only just made it above the poverty threshold, and they're much closer to extreme poverty than to middle income. They could just as easily slip back. Dead wrong. Progress has been even greater than that. Pew Institute took a close examination of the years 2001 to 2011, and during those 10 years, 669 million people rose out of extreme poverty defined as $2 a day. Meanwhile, slightly more than half of that number, 386 million people, rose above the level defined as middle income, between $10 a day and $20 a day. So the global middle income population almost doubled in just 10 years. That's incredibly important because that's the level where historically and traditionally people can start to invest in their children's future and in their education and really begin to demand social reforms and democracy. And that is happening right now. The poor will not always be with us. The middle class will. Gosh, I'm sorry I'm late. I had to wait hours for a normal cab since I don't use Uber. Sure, Uber would have been more convenient, but I'm a considerate person. I think about the costs I impose on society. Dead wrong. Car-hailing apps like Uber actually reduce the negative externalities associated with car transportation. For example, it has been shown that it reduces traffic congestion in urban areas. Why? Well, for many reasons. The software directs the driver to the right place at the right time, so they don't have to drive around for a long time searching for customers. And as fewer people use their own car, they don't have to drive around in search for a parking lot. Car sharing also often results in more than one person per car. And this strategy with price surging at peak hours divert people away from the moments when there are most cars out on the roads. So it's good in so many ways, and since I lose less time searching for a cab when I use Uber, I can stay here longer, giving you more arguments. It reduces commuter stress. It reduces carbon dioxide emissions. And I don't have to own a car of my own. I can just sit here, waiting. I'm not in a rush anymore. The American debate gets more toxic by the day. With aggressive rhetoric and open racism, hate crime in the US increased by 17% in just 1 year. That's dead wrong. Look, I don't have to go further than my own Twitter feed to notice that something is wrong, and Donald Trump's aggression against journalists and immigrants is dangerous. It only takes one nutcase with a gun. But precisely because tribalism is so incredibly destructive and hate breeds hate, we shouldn't give the impression that
everybody is going crazy and that this is now spiraling out of control. Yes, the FBI reports 17% more hate crimes in 2017 than in 2016. But perhaps this is because we pay more attention to those crimes now. If you look at the methodology, we see that 895 more law enforcement agencies participated in data gathering in 2017 than in 2016. And as Robbie Suave points out in Reason, if every agency that reported for the first time reported just one crime each, it accounts for almost the entire increase.
Because of mass immigration, my country has seen a surge in sexual assaults. Sweden is now the rape capital of the world. Oft repeated, but dead wrong. Yes, Sweden has more reported offences, but the willingness to report differs dramatically. Where you talk openly about such crimes and don't blame the victim, you'll also see more cases being reported. And Sweden differs in two more ways. If a husband rapes his wife once a week, this is filed as 52 separate cases a year in Sweden to make the crime more visible. In most countries it would be one case. In Saudi Arabia, 0 cases. And after pressure from feminists, the definition of rape was extended in 2005 to include sexual offences not counted as rape in most countries. In that year alone, the number of cases increased by 66%. This is the reason why some people who claim that Sweden is the rape capital of the world also claim that Julian Assange is being investigated for rape in Sweden for doing almost nothing. So Sweden has more sexual offences reported, not because we are more criminal or have more immigrants, but because we are more feminist. They took our jobs. The Chinese. One oft-quoted study showed that the US lost 2.4 million manufacturing jobs in 12 years. The Chinese took our jobs and destroyed our economy. Dead wrong. Sure, 2.4 million jobs in 12 years sounds like a lot. But you know what? The US economy loses almost 5 million jobs every month. And who created most of those jobs? The answer might surprise you. The companies most exposed to Chinese competition. Sure, they lost some jobs, but they also created more new jobs in the areas where China is less competitive. And they could expand production because they use cheaper inputs imported from China. One recent study showed that firms exposed to China expanded employment by 2% more per year than other firms. Critics say it's not the same jobs, and that's true. These jobs are better. Manufacturing jobs that pay higher wages because they're in areas where America is more competitive. And it's also service jobs that are complementary to high-tech manufacturing, like engineering, research and development, and design. So sure, they took our jobs, but they gave us better jobs in return.
And you took my job! They took our jobs! They took our jobs! They took his job. I know. Shh. Oh man, they took his job. They took it. Animal control came and got him. They took his dog. Damn it, they took our bill. Yeah, they took our yeah. They took our deer.